Hey everyone, I'm Marty, and I'm excited to talk to you all about product roadmaps. Well, specifically, the road trips that get us there. And I'll start with a quick introduction. I actually started my career off as a designer and front-end engineer, but I've been working in product management for a bit over a decade now. And I've spent the majority of my career as an entrepreneur really playing that hybrid role between CEO and PM. I was fortunate enough to sell my first company to Twitter, where I went on to join as their very first design manager. And then more recently, I sold my last company to Eventbrite, where I went on to join as their head of R&D, which at Eventbrite really meant focusing on new ways to monetize from a product perspective. Now, in between that, I did a stint at the White House as a presidential innovation fellow for the Obama administration. And then I also spent several years as an angel investor, investing in everything from early stage startups, ones that you might not have heard of yet, like Capbase or dialup.com, and then later stage startups that hopefully you've most likely heard of, such as Chime or SpaceX. I only mention this because I've seen a lot of different products be developed in a variety of different atmospheres throughout my years. And I've been fortunate enough to see them through a diversity of lenses, as the designer, as the front end, as the PM, as the CEO, as the investor, and then across a variety of different sort of segments, from government to startups, early stage, late stage, pre-IPO, through IPO, and then even beyond. And one thing that I've seen is that as product managers, I've noticed that we spend a lot of our time focused on the roadmap. And I've noticed we rarely talk about the road trip to get there. We tend to hyper-focus on KPIs, OKRs, but these measure the end result. And postmortems are always sort of an after the fact. We know it's the team that gets us there. We talk about team a lot. We also spend a lot of our time talking about team and team dynamics, but what we don't talk about is the getting us there. It's the team that gets us there, but let's actually hyper focus on the getting us there part. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about now with road trips. And what I want to do is I want us to go on a bit of a road trip. I'm talking to you right now from Los Gatos, California, and it's just an hour south of San Francisco. And for those of you not familiar with the Bay Area, this is Netflix, Tesla, and PayPal country. And we're gonna, on this road trip, we're gonna go to one of my favorite cities, Asheville, North Carolina. I like it so much. I actually got married there last summer. But before we jump in, before I get started, I want to talk about constraint number one. The biggest thing I've seen out of product teams is that we often act like real estate agents. We live and die by the comp. We can't seem to move forward without a comparison of some sort. We compare ourselves to everyone. We compare ourselves to other companies, to our competitors. We often compare ourselves to startups. We want to know what have they done before us and how did they do it. We'll talk a lot about disruption and innovation, but for the most part, we're looking for a case study. We're looking for a comparable. We're looking for someone who's done it before. We want to do something new. We want to do something revolutionary. We want to lead. We want to not follow. But we do tend to find ourselves looking for, who did the thing no one else had done before us before we do the thing that no one's ever done before, which, can be a little counterintuitive. But what we need to remember is that every person is different. Every team is different. Every company is different. And they're all different at different moments in time. We can read about how sort of Netflix started. But I think what's important, because that's a very popular sort of origin story for folks. But what's important about the Netflix story is that we're not Netflix. And we're not doing what Netflix did when Netflix did it. We're not that size. We're not at that stage or in that industry or against that particular competitor. And the world is not where it was when it was. Even the companies we work for today are not who they were when they started. And, they're not even who they are. Who they are today isn't who they'll be tomorrow. And I think what's important about this is neither are you. You're not who you were yesterday and you're not who you will be tomorrow. These moments in time are going to prove pretty important to us. And so one thing I look back on is that every company that I've ever worked with, from Twitter to the White House to Eventbrite, at some point has asked the exact same question. And usually it's in my first 2 weeks of working there. And they ask, how do we move faster? And then most specifically, they ask, how do we act more like a startup? Which, that in itself, I always find interesting because they themselves are most likely a startup and a very successful billion-dollar startup. So, I tend to wonder, like, why the heck are you even asking me? Shouldn't I be asking you? Like, how did you do it? But therein lies the problem. It's kind of the challenge is wedded in that problem. But it's that the team that got them there is no longer the team moving them forward. The founders who wrote the first lines of code no longer write code. The first employee who hustled now manages. So what I would argue is that we should not start our endeavors by comparing our frameworks to, say, Y Combinator, or our strategies to Uber, or our processes to Google. We should start by asking ourselves, who are we and when are we? I think that last one's critically important. The when are we? Because the who are we will fundamentally change throughout sort of time. So like when I go back to these road trips, road trips across the country during the era of, say, the Oregon Trail are a lot different than road trips today in, say, a Tesla. I mean, there's only 2 superchargers in Utah. So like it's a pretty rough trip. And this is where I get hung up the most. Sometimes it gets me into a bit of trouble, and there's this huge distinction between aligning and preparing. Our PRDs prepare us, but it's our relationships that align us. For most of my career, the competitive advantage has been speed, and there's no faster accelerant than uncomfortability. If we're in The Amazing Race right now, the popular TV show, and the clock just started, I'd want to just jump in the car and go. I mean, I have no idea how to get to North Carolina from California, but I do know how to drive east. And honestly, 90% of this project is going to simply be driving east. But I've also had the opportunity where I've driven across the country a half dozen times before. So I've seen some variant of this problem before. I know the fastest you could reasonably do this trip is roughly 36 hours. The fastest you'd want to actually do it is 3 days. And it should probably never take you more than 8 days. I mean, if you're going to see Yellowstone or stop at Dollywood along the way. Now, my co-founders know that I know this, or rather they know I wouldn't jump into the car without knowing this. So they're quick to just jump in with me. But you don't know me, and you have no reason to trust me. The 2 decades of credibility I've built kind of mean nothing to you. And when it comes to being in a car together on this trip that's new to you, it becomes very uncomfortable. And so to move at the speed of uncomfortability is an advantage for me and my co-founders because we already know each other. There's already a built-in trust. But the speed of uncomfortability for you and I in a car on a road trip right now becomes inversely a disadvantage. And that's where I think we need to start. The alignment isn't a conversation of transparency. It's an understanding of the team. We know our teams the best through things like how was your weekend small talk or the offsite trust fall. But what I've noticed is we rarely take the time to reset expectations around who on the team has seen some version of the problem ahead of us, who is going into it as a completely new experience. I'm the most guilty of this. I work on this all the time, but what I have to remember, what I implore us to remember, is to ask of our teams, every time that we get into it together, what are we doing? What fundamentally is this? And then, what is it like? What is it most like, that we've seen before, but knowing that it itself is different? And then what have we done previously that is similar? And then we as the collective team, but then we individually, who else has already driven across country? Who else has seen some variation of this problem before? Now, it's going to sound so obvious that you're going to wonder why I even mention it, but we have to spend as much time talking to our team about the product as we do our customers. Our team's experiences, even the lack thereof, have a tremendous impact on the outcome of what we deliver. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but we tend, as product leaders, to hyper-focus on the roadmap. We go starting from point A and measuring our progress all the way to point B because because of this, we're naturally over-indexed on getting started and finishing. That's typically what we call a roadmap. And where is the product now versus where the product will be tomorrow? Like that's kind of our fundamental questions, right? Like what do we have today? What do we want it to be tomorrow? And then what is the distance between the two that we will travel in order to get there? And I think that's where the hang up is that everything in between point A and point B, that's where the magic actually happens. That is the road trip, but it isn't where we hyper focus, and it isn't where we spend most of our time on kicking things off and getting things started and then measuring the outcome of those results. That tends to be our hyper focus. And a growing trend that I've noticed recently is this desire to give teams more autonomy. But when we actually look at what part of the process are autonomous and which are not, we're seeing that it's using the term to skip past the middle, almost to ignore it, and that's the road trip, and that's where my concern comes in. We're calling it autonomy, but we're often still constrained with where and when we start, as well as when and to what we end with. So, by the time, let's just say, back to the road trip that we're going to take to Asheville, by the time this presentation's over, we have to leave. Today is the day, and you have to go to Asheville by car, and you have to do it within a week. But you have the autonomy on how to get there. So while beggars can't be choosers, I'll take autonomy when it's offered. But my fear here is that it's often a mechanism to punt on the most important part of the adventure, to ignore everything between point A to point B. And here's what the point of all this is. As product leaders, our deliverables might be product requirement documents or proving product market fit, but that's not the job. The PRD is the tentative itinerary, and the PMF score is essentially the scrapbook at the end of it all. The job description is building trust with what is oftentimes essentially a group of strangers in a metal tin box traveling across mountains and through deserts, everything in between getting from point A to point B. And, we do focus a lot of our energy with our, say, design counterparts on the what, and our engineering counterparts on the how, and then closing the gap on the when. But the most important element for a team is the road trip together is why. And I'm not talking about user stories. I'm not talking about research or empathy for the customer. I'm talking about providing answers to the why now and the why then. So, I'm looking at why do we have to leave for this road trip right after this presentation? What changes at 12:30 p.m. Pacific versus, say, 1:30 p.m. Pacific, or even, from this afternoon to, say, tomorrow morning? Why the urgency? Where's that coming from? What's the origin here? What's driving that? Why do we have to be there in a week? Our deadlines can often feel very arbitrary, which makes it, that's what it's supposed to be. It's what makes what's supposed to be an adventure sort of feel like pure chaos. And, that's not fun. That's where the work feels like work, and the adventure starts feeling like an adventure and starts feeling like chaos. And, that's where we tend to watch things unravel. And so I implore us to remember, well, I'll tell you about a time I remember. I remember that I used to work for this company, this publishing company, earlier in my career. And when my manager would ask for something, I'd ask back, when would you like it by? When is this due? And he'd always do the same thing. He'd kind of tilt his head, he'd look up, and he'd go, Friday. And I'm thinking, like, I can literally see you make that up, like right in front of me. You're making up this date, and it feels demoralizing. It makes me uninterested. I have no real incentive to hit something that feels made up or made believe, or where there's no logic behind it, or there's no intention or meaning. It makes it feel like my time isn't valuable or worthy, and then that ultimately makes, as like a human being, start to feel a little bit more like worthless or like unintentional. And the other one that's one of my favorites, other than this, manager head up looking, and we've all probably experienced that or seen it. But my other favorite is when they say it's due on March 31st, and then I wonder, how did they pick that date? Like that specific date at exactly that happens to be at the exact end of the month, at exactly the end of the quarter. What are the odds that the driving factors behind delivering this project magically landed then and there? Not to mention that like the 31st of March on this particular year was a Saturday, right? Which is just like a clear indication that when was like the concept of when it was due is in fact like completely arbitrary. And we focus, as a group on resourcing. We focus a lot of attention there, and it's very easy to lose sight of that human element. I think even now we're feeling it, and we're losing sight of the fact that you can't book Zoom meetings, back to back. You have to leave time for a person to eat lunch. You have to give a person like a moment to pee, right? It's easy to forget about time off, holidays, just internal like team meetings, get-togethers, gatherings, or just like experiences that we have together, and the fact that like we all sometimes just need like to pee. And so I find it interesting that like as product leaders we're so good at measuring things like customer churn or software latency. We understand the complexities of like flywheel effects, getting users through the funnels, even things like queuing theory. And at the same time, if you ask any of us what the most important element of it all is, we'd most likely say the team. But we ourselves, we punt on that to our engineering manager counterparts. For those of us who are pretty strong engineering centric organizations, we punt it to our HR managers. When creating these roadmaps, we often don't take into consideration the churn of a team, the impacts of human latency, or even how like queuing theory might apply to our own product, or not just to our own product, but like to ourselves. Like, let's just take queuing theory as an example. It's a relatively simple equation. Essentially P equals lambda over upsilon, and the magic happens when P is greater than or equal to 1. And what I mean is that like when we apply this to our own team dynamics, it's the question becomes, is the time to do the work, over top of divided by the time given to do the work, in balance or not? We can certainly make it from Los Gatos to Asheville in 36 hours, but the question is, should we? And, we could look at things like stopping at Yellowstone. It has no impact on this project. In fact, you could make the argument that it actually has a negative impact on timing. It slows us down. It might even be a little out of the way. But we have to stop and ask ourselves, what's the positive impact on things like churn, or even, the CLV of a team? And so, my intention with this talk is, not to get derailed on, a teamwork makes the dream work talk, or to be too cliche about happiness. My biggest takeaways are kind of threefold. One, let's put as much intention on everything between kickoff and launch as you do on preparing to start and measure the end result. Let's drive the conversation to be more about the why. The very specific timing on the adventure ahead is important to the core business. So why now? Why is this happening? Why do we have to deliver these features? What are the impact they're going to have? We do a good job at our company all hands these days of having some sense of transparency, or some awareness of where the company's headed. We'll do our H1 look, or our half year sort of where the company's goals are holistically, but we don't do a good job tying them back, because a lot of times those overarching goals, they're so high level that again they become arbitrary. Again, we want to move up market. Us moving up market doesn't explain why the due date is March 31st. and why it can't be June 2nd or July 3rd. How does one tie back to the other? And so it's connecting the dots, everything in between. And so, there'll be a lot of dependencies on other teams and other deliverables, but why are we doing this? What is its impact directly, specifically? And then, how does that drive the when? In knowing, what those arbitrary dates are, and removing the word arbitrary from them. The last one is just removing the mental model. That mental model that your team is on this project at this moment in time is it's not like any other team at any other moment in time at any other company. There really is no comp. Sure. Two houses on the same cul-de-sac in the same neighborhood, can relatively be priced the same, but they are different, and there are things that make them unique. And I think when you go look at a house to decide that's where you're going to live, you don't look at them all the same, even though the comps were run the same, and the pricing of the house is based on these comps. You hyper focus on the wallpaper that was put in, forgetting that you could easily remove it, or the number of bathrooms, or the distance between being able to hear the nursery to your master bedroom, or if your master bedroom has a walk-in closet, or the size of that walk-in closet, or if there's a place for your shoes, or do you have a deck, or is there a place to install a hot tub? These are all be things that would differentiate. And so I think the same thing happens with our comps when we look at our teams. Yeah, we can find things that are somewhat similar, but I would implore us to understand that it's healthy to do a reset every time. Almost every time that you're working, especially if you're working with a new team or you've added new team members, which for any of us in high growth companies is a pretty frequent thing. If you're working in a small company, you're going to build that trust, and you're going to start moving fast just inherently. But for larger companies, higher growth, where there's always new teams and there's always things like reorgs or reshuffles, and you're working with a new set of people, do that reset. Ask every time who's new to this particular experience. Don't take anything for granted. Don't make any assumptions. And then I think more importantly, find out who's been through some version of this before. Even if we're building something for home mortgage lending, let's understand that somebody who worked in the social space or the event space or the political space, there might be some correlation. There might be some overlap. There might be something around GDPR or PII. There might be other rules or regulations. There might be things where at off first cuff, we didn't think were applicable, but they actually turned out to be. And there actually is just one more thing. The last thing I think to remember is that our roadmaps are the job. Our road trips are the adventure. I'm going to run out of time here real quick, and I've been rambling a little bit, and I want to make sure I leave enough time sort of for discussion and conversation. I'm really curious what you think about the distinction between a roadmap, a road trip, how you apply that mental energy, or if you don't, into your own organization. But I think we've all been trained in thinking about the roadmap. I think we've all been trained in hyper focusing on the metrics and the numbers, tracking, measuring, learning, iterating, pivoting. These are all fundamental, critical things. But in everything else, we take for granted. I think we make assumptions about the team dynamics, the point A to point B, onboarding new folks. It all becomes so transactional. And I think that's the disservice. And I want to implore us to make it a bigger part of the process, and to remember that we kind of have to do this reset every time, that every project is different, and every team member is different on every project, and we can't take anything for granted. So I'll stop rambling there. Road trips, road maps, big distinction between the two. A lot of it's about trust, a lot of it's about communication. But I think the majority of it is just knowing that there is no real true comp. So would love to talk more on the discussions. I'm here to chat. And then also just in general, my email's super easy. I'm Marty@marty.com. Would love to hear from you. And then shameless plug @Smarty, SMARTY on Twitter. Feel free to ping me there as well. I could always use more followers.